everyone. Thanks for showing up to our conference. My name is Claudia Schwarz. I'm one of the co-organizers, and I'm super happy with all the talks we heard this morning. And putting it into context, that's what we are doing here. That means for me also to now again remind us of what we have here and what is this setting we have, what's the set. So on the podium, we have our four speakers who had their specific perspective on the topic. So we have Christine, the philosopher, who taught us about the relativity of time in the psychedelic experience, and that the hero's journey is not the only way to tell the story, and that up can be down and down can be up, like with Alice in Wonderland. Then we have Katie, who is an anthropologist. So she went out into the wild, in the wilderness of the psychedelic studies, and she engaged with MDMA researchers on site, and also, is now taking a bit of a broader cultural look at the whole thing in the US now. And then we have Luke, who has his historical view on not just psychedelics, but on drugs in culture and society as a whole, which is also very important for us to see. Drugs are, re-emerging and then disappearing again from the more overground view, and they have their highs and their lows. So like an individual drug experience, drugs also have their cultural experience and their journey. And then we had Eduardo, who is our only non-global north speaker. We're glad to have him here on the panel to represent the global south. And he's also representing the neuroscientific perspective, but a more atypical neuroscientific perspective. So he's very aware, as we've seen, of the contextual and cultural dimensions of neuroscience. And this is just to remind us again what we have available here in the discussion section. And yes, we start first with a little discussion amongst the panel. So how you understood each other and how you feel your talks stand in perspective with each other and form this specific context in which you are now. And is there something that's coming up for you at this moment?
Well, brilliant. It's on. The thing that's coming up for me, I suppose, very quickly, and maybe this is a little glib, I definitely appreciate the multidisciplinarity that we have on show. What we've sought to, I think, do at UW-Madison in naming our center the Transdisciplinary Center is think about how community engagement is also important when thinking through some major problems and issues with psychedelics. And so this is a perspective that's not here, but something that we should certainly think about incorporating in the future is the public and the public's voice. That's my quick reaction.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, we have the public here as the audience, and they will jump in later. But you're completely right that what's needed is to move also beyond the more academic expertise circles, and especially bringing in also, yeah, the perspectives of those with lived experience of conditions, and what also Christine hinted at, to kind of elevate experience again in this psychedelic moment and revival we are in.
There's actually an interesting point between this question that I've raised, because Lucas raised it as well. When we think about big data and the ways in which collecting experience can be sort of something like the Arrowhead trip reports, maybe, that people are now analyzing and using for scientific analysis of, which has its own methodological challenges I don't want to go into, because they're quite an interesting open format. But also this way in which there's a tendency that I found myself saying things like, maybe we could use the experience in the space, in the subculture, but the word use alone then sort of makes me sort of tight in the throat. And I think, wait a minute, how would you actually draw on experience without owning it or turning it again into the property of others? This way, that discussion we have with indigenous experiences and how they are woven into the psychedelic space in this very problematic way of, that is a mix between recognition and erasure, where sort of first you recognize, then you grab, then you erase the legitimacy of it, because you have now transformed it into some proper academically evaluated, sanctioned, published in Nature kind of material. But of course, not necessarily with indigenous people actually articulating that voice. That same problem would apply when we draw on subculture experiences of the therapists who have been using psychedelics in the underground at the risk of persecution because of the criminalization, the people in the religious community. So there is a way in which the data gathering practice is always problematic, because we take and use mechanisms of appropriation. By collecting the data, analyzing it, representing it, publishing it. So there is a way in which this question of experience, when you put it out as a scientific method, always falls into the same traps as had already pointed.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Tomorrow we're going to have one speaker addressing specifically this question of indigenous epistemologies and rights and ethics. Make this also statement here that we strive to have diversity in the panel. So I'm happy to see gender balance. I'm happy to see at least one Global South speaker on each day. The other one is tomorrow, Fernanda, who's also Brazilian, who unfortunately will have to speak online because of flight cancellations and delays and overbooking. So I'll leave this more for tomorrow. What I think really was really striking for me, it's like I kind of felt a sequence in the four talks, and Luke came with like this broader historical view with psychedelics and other drug examples of these cycles of how society understand these substances and these cycles of hype and anti-hype, or I don't know which word to use here, sometimes even demonization, right? We saw in the 20th century lots of demonization about psychedelics and really fake news being spread out, and movies, scary movies being financed by government departments and so on. Now we may be seeing something different. And then I think me and Catherine, we focus more on the current cycle of psychedelic medicalization. I did more the epistemology of the RCTs, the problem of putting them as the gold standard above everything else. She gave like an excellent description of the issues in one particular case, which is the recent MDMA assisted therapy evaluation by the FDA here in the United States. And then Christine came with reflections about the psychedelic experience, not the psychedelic drug, but the psychedelic experience, what humans who ingest these substances go through. And I think all the talks in somehow, like what Christine was saying in the end, was somehow present in all the three preceding talks, right? And the way that you put that, in the 60s, the drug was seen as dangerous, and now it's the therapy that's seen as dangerous. I think connect with my point of these fears of charlatanism, these fears of not having been objectified and controlled and standardized enough. So I think these are great points for further discussion today.
Well, I'll just pick up on that topic briefly in thinking about this cycle that we're in right now and the perceived or real dangers of therapy. What seems clear as a through line from the 60s, 50s to the present moment is the contestability of what happens in the room itself and how people conduct themselves, the therapists in the room. And so within the 50s and the 60s, there was widespread discussion around whether or not the provider and the therapist ought to have experienced the drug themselves, which is obviously a debate that we're dealing with now. And so in the 60s and the 50s, you had physicians, scientists who were directly opposed on this subject. Johns Hopkins scientists were suggesting that it made no sense for the therapist to have tried the drugs themselves. Do they take electrotherapy, electroshock therapy? Do they have brain surgery to be able to do their jobs? This is sort of the questions that they asked. Whereas people at Spring Grove Hospital were saying, well, actually, it made sense to have had the experience. It enabled more empathy and to be able to see the ebb and the flow within the room. So that's definitely one through line, but another through line that came from the different panels, for me at least, was the nature of professional identity and the ways in which professions themselves are engaging or failing to engage to answer the big questions. So physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, how did they work with each other in the 50s and the 60s? The answer is very poorly. They didn't figure out how you might operationalize. And I think the same thing is happening now, where there's policing of different boundaries. And that became very clear to me in the different talks, is how professional boundaries still are a major point to be sorted out.
An issue that comes up here is perhaps also the hierarchy among different professions. I think, as we've seen in the FDA panel, there were some hierarchies already in that and in the discussion, and also who was invited and who was not invited. Maybe, Katie, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually did sit down and look very carefully at who was on the panel and their kind of disciplinary backgrounds. There were a couple interesting moments I couldn't pull into the talk, but one of the questions when they got into functional unblinding was whether or not patients were sort of unable to be able to tell their own story about their PTSD, right? Were there, when they were reporting their symptoms, was this biased? And there was a nice moment because they did have a patient representative who pushed back on this and said, look, this is not, like, I know when I'm experiencing symptoms of PTSD. And so in some ways, I think it reminded, like, so there was these moments that there were actually moments of pushback against some of these narratives about functional unblinding and expectancy effect, and saying, wait a second, saying that this is entirely just people fabricating it in their own head really undermines how much people who live with PTSD are very in touch with their own symptoms and can actually speak to whether or not there is improvement. So there were some interesting moments, but the way I look at it is, the way that the FDA set up that panel was to see, can we get institutional buy-in from pharmacology and specifically from the VA? Because there was a lot of, and that's because the VA is like one of the major research organizations around PTSD. And I think what the committee said was they didn't have institutional buy-in. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about that is really key here is the way that insurance in medical care in the US works. And so, we laugh, right? Because of course, right? But, insurance companies are this moment where capitalism and epistemology meet in a very specific way. and that is how one of the undercurrents within these debates have been, fine, you have this therapy and maybe it works, but it's extraordinarily expensive. And is the juice, I think this was actually a quote from one of the ICER meetings, which preceded this, from one of the insurance companies, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so I think if there's as we kind of, as much as we want to talk about epistemology in interesting ways, I think we also have to think about the way that healthcare in the US is very much shaped by the kinds of epistemological questions insurance companies ask, right? So it's, for them, the question is, who are we going to give this very expensive therapy to? And can we make the case that it is worth it to try to do it? And I think those questions were shaping some of the background of what was going on as well, so.
Why is the therapy so expensive is an interesting question. I mean, if you have some 10 hours of psychotherapy, that isn't that expensive compared to long-term not being able to work, for instance, to use the insurance, health insurance categories here, in all their utilitarianism. So the price that we have attached now to say one dose of psilocybin of being several $1,000s for something that just actually grows in the woods in October and November is quite estranging. And the price, the ways in which prices are created here, I think needs to be looked at. It's not that simple. But also the question is, of course, you said this about professionalization, and there are maybe these professional points of view. I've been part of a clinical trial in stem cell research, which was with autologous stem cells, so they couldn't be patented. And we had very often this, when I went to a conference talking about this trial, I was asked every time at every conference by several people, lawyers, or some scientists from industry, so why are these physicians doing this? There is no IP in it. And why would, what world is it in which the primary orientation to which all others have to cave in for a physician is whether or not the treatment they are trialing has potential IP in it? So there is something twisted where even the professional ethics of the physician suddenly becomes something that is only derived and legitimate if it fits in with a capitalist order and the ways in which some countries do and others don't have particular forms of health insurance. This seems such a sort of complex real world distortion. And one of the reasons why so many people in health professions quit their jobs, I think that needs to be not taken as something to buy into, that needs to be taken as something to always put on the spot and really criticize. That searching for new medical treatments cannot and should not be oriented by that as a primary guiding factor for what is even worth investigating.
Yeah, so maybe we move on to you, the audience, and the questions you have. We have a microphone that's moving around. If you ask a question, please say your name first and where you're from and what's your background so that we also know your context.
My name is Mark Michaels. I'm a lawyer by training, no longer practicing. I'm very involved with psychedelic work personally, and I'm in a training program also. Picking up on this capitalism issue, one of the things, and related also to boundaries, professional boundaries, it sort of seemed to me that one of the real problems in what happened with the MDMA trials is that MAPS started out as a research and advocacy organization. But in order to get into this whole process, they had to spin off a business. It all became about how can we monetize this treatment and make it worthwhile to go through the whole trial process. And that seems to me to be a place where we're really kind of in trouble in terms of making the most of the potential in psychedelics, because none of them are patentable. And now you have, people trying to come up with analogs to psilocybin that they can patent or whatever. But the actual substances themselves are all out of patent. So I wonder how that relates kind of to the disciplinary discussion, sort of from the other side, from the applicant side, and these disciplinary boundaries that formerly existed but are now being all blurred. So I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
Just a quick reminder for those asking questions, please be close to the mic, otherwise people on Zoom will not hear. Once you get that one.
Well, I think it's very important issues that you're raising. From the historical perspective, if I can say I represent history, which is kind of at any rate, historical evidence has been used in some of the third-party submissions to help with patents that have been submitted that are overly broad. And so there are organizations that have been collecting as much data as they can, prior art is what they call it, legalese, to enable individuals to challenge overly broad patents. So history has a place to certainly play in this respect. I'll just end that.
Yeah, I noticed one curious thing relating to your question is not really answering it. It's a big question that you brought, but to me it's particularly curious how MDMA, which is from the most well-known psychedelics or almost psychedelic drugs, because some people don't like to call MDMA a psychedelic, but anyway. MDMA is one of the farthest from indigenous rights and issues. It's not completely disconnected because Sasha Shulgin only looked at MDMA because of similarity with mescaline, which, indigenous knowledge is behind there. But MDMA was trying to be developed free of patents and in a different commercial view. And the ones who are closer connected with indigenous rights and knowledge, such as psilocybin, have been patented. So it seems to be inverted regarding indigenous issues. And these commercial models, these approaches for, they interest not only investors, but also, I think, the drug regulators. So I think all these issues, we can kind of feel that they were part of this evaluation by the advisory committee and so on. And then getting back to another point that Claudia brought up about the composition of these committees, the FDA AdCom was pretty much psychiatrists, neuropsychiatrists, and child psychiatrists, and patient representative, and a statistician. And when we look to the Dutch government report that came out in the same period, it's like many more people, and they invited even owners of nightclubs to give their perspectives on the drug ecstasy. So there were psychiatrists, there were anthropologists, statisticians, but also more diversity and more people. And they came to a different conclusion. The Dutch government is recommending this treatment and is engaging with the European Medicines Agency to say, what shall we do if no drug sponsor is putting this forward?
And I'll add one thing. I think when we, again, so part of what I was trying to get at when I say we have to think of the context of United States medicine was in many ways very much in line with Christine's point, right? The reason why something like MDMA-assisted therapy is going to be extraordinarily expensive in the US is not necessarily because of the drug. And I think even laying that at the feet of MAPS is not fair. You know, if I go in and I have to go to an emergency room and they hand me aspirin I'm going to be charged several $1,000s for them handing me a very cheap medication that's been around for quite some time, right? And it's the way that the American medical system works right now, where all of those costs are part of the institution of US medicine, the training of doctors and nurses, the labor that has to go into it, and the absorbing of the costs for people who are uninsured, right? I mean, if we don't have any economists in this room, but they would probably talk about how that drives up these costs. And so I think what I'm trying to highlight is that part of the issue here is also about the price we're paying for a medicalized model, right? Which is not just about for-profit, but it's about the fact that we don't have an equitable way of distributing healthcare in the United States. So, yeah.
I mean, that's just following on from this, the medicalized model. There is this point that I've been making about diagnosis being alienating in itself. As long as people think that the route towards the decriminalization of psychedelics goes via the medicalization of psychedelics, which was for a while something many people believed in. And I think we are now at a point where we see that this has run against a wall. And from my experience with other such novel treatment pathways in other disciplines, I never found this particularly convincing because of the way in which on the one hand, you limit the people to those who are actually diagnosed with a severe illness and who accept being diagnosed with a severe illness. So where this sort of description falling within DSM categories is already the way in which they have to live, which is hard, you know. This is people who are much more troubled than many people who use psychedelics, who find them helpful. Yeah? So I think we need to decriminalize. And then the question is, how can this work without the medical model? And thinking, what is the special status of the people who use psychedelics as medicines because they are severely ill? That should be a specific category, you know? There needs an awareness that maybe people who feel very vulnerable and emotionally or mentally unstable should not experiment at home alone in their bedroom with psychedelic drugs, like there are many other things we wouldn't recommend them to try. So, but this is a sort of, gets us back to this first point of the public. The rejection of this petition 4 in Massachusetts on the decriminalization of some natural psychedelics, which was not accepted in the election last week, is sort of showing to a degree that this understanding that I've just articulated is obviously not very widespread. So there is a way in which we have to definitely come up with much better communication against the vilification of psychedelics having become this exceptional thing. Because maybe psychedelic experiences are not that exceptional. Yeah? And we need to maybe reframe the extraordinary in terms of being so special that there are all these safeguards to be put up. From my European perspective, especially in a country that has the gun laws the US has, that is really puzzling. That you would protect people from psychedelics when everybody can have a gun at them.
Thanks, Christine. I'm curious, taking up this point about the psychedelic exceptionalism and whether it's actually true. Thinking also about the comparison with other drugs and what Luke told us. Is there something we can learn from history or from other drug histories, and how to embed psychedelics in that broader picture in order to counter maybe now at this historical moment making certain mistakes that maybe we've already gone through? Or what is your maybe view from that broader drug perspective?
You're putting me on the spot. That's okay. I'll do my best in trying to think through some of the lessons that we can pull from wider drug history.
Of course, everybody can have the answer to this question. It's a collective answer.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to take a shot?
It's for you.
I'm drawn a little bit to the concept of undone science and impure science when thinking about this and the ways in which science itself, which my excellent colleagues have talked about, the sort of the peculiarities and the difficulties in reconciling the knowledge creation. And so it seems to me, at least with when we're thinking through how certain drugs move from that realm of licit to illicit, accepted, demonized, we really sort of have to be able to unpack the knowledges that have been created around, for example, cocaine as a treatment, or heroin as a treatment, or morphine as a treatment. And when we look at sort of the totality or the breadth of these drugs that have moved across lines of legitimate and illegitimate, what we see, I think, is huge amounts of contestability between members of the public, capitalist logics, and then the scientific community. That would be my short answer.
I think this topic of exceptionalism is a very interesting one, and we should avoid both extremes. So going like psychedelics are completely exceptional and different than anything else and need to be handled differently in law, ethics, and every field, I think is a problematic exaggeration, but also treating them as any other drug is also problematic and exaggeration. In terms of medicalization, I think there's great danger if the system is somehow implemented for doctors to prescribe psilocybin as they do CBD, for example. And then it goes back, why? What's the big difference? Is the intensity, profundity, and duration of the subjective experience that is being erased or dismissed.
I would also add, if we're gonna, these drug cycles are not isolated, but they influence each other, right? So right at the moment where opioids are really peaking their critique, we also see kind of a wave of hope around psychedelic substances. And I don't think those two things are totally disconnected. But then I think you saw the opioid wave crash against psychedelics and also the cannabis wave, because the decriminalization and the kind of legalization of recreational cannabis have sort of triggered all these public health concerns around cannabis, that the young people are using it, we're having greater psychiatric events. And so I think in many ways, those things have influenced the kind of caution that suddenly came up. I didn't get into the safety debates. The safety debates were also super interesting. But suddenly, like, having a euphoric event is an adverse event, right? Like, that's a paradox. Feeling good is bad. And that is something that I think is very much about kind of the cycles that are happening around cannabis and opioids, and that are influencing now these psychedelic discussions in ways that weren't there sort of maybe 10 years ago quite as much. At least I think at one point it seemed like the euphoric effects of MDMA and their lack of evidence that they led to substance use disorders felt somewhat settled. And then it sort of reared up again in a way that I think is probably tied to fears around this idea that licit use can drive illicit use in this really interesting way that comes up now, that suddenly if we make a legal drug that was used to be illicit, then we will continue to have illicit, and maybe we even have illicit grow. And that fear, I think, is very much a public health fear that is kind of running through a lot of mainstream medicine, and that is also part of a backlash against psychedelics. So,
like some audience questions.
Yeah, sure.
Check in with Joseph about the chat and online
Yeah,
participants.
can you hear
Yes,
me?
of course, the people online are also able, should be able to write their questions in the chat.
Are you able to hear me? No, I assume online can. You can't hear me. Okay, I'll text it. Hold on. Yep.
I
The
think
audio
it's,
in the room is off. So,
Osiris, right?
yep.
The question. So I can
Hello,
read
can you
the
hear me?
question that Osiris.
Can you hear me?
So
They
Osiris
won't be able to hear
Gonzalez
you, Osiris. She'll read out.
asks, which alternatives or epistemologies allows to achieve a better understanding of psychedelics' role in society and culture beyond medicalization? Which alternatives or epistemologies allow to achieve a better understanding of psychedelics' role in society and culture beyond medicalization?
Well, I would say it would be important to broaden the idea of medicalization. So there can be many different types of medicalization, and maybe we're talking about here let's say, a hardcore biomedicalization in the lines of biological psychiatry. This type doesn't seem to fit well because of the characteristics of the subjective experience of psychedelics. So I think Christine Greta did a great job on her talk. And I'm also reading The Blind Spot. I'm happy to be a bit close with one of the authors who's also Brazilian, physicist Marcelo Gleiser. So I knew about the book before the book was published, actually. And that's what they're discussing there. It's almost like a new kind of science. It's like science really acknowledging and admitting that subjective experience is there, it exists. It's not something that we can scientifically measure. We can have some questionnaires, we can have phenomenology, we can have qualitative, but like the menu is never the dinner. So the words are never the experience that people feel, right? So I think we really need to think broader here. There may be other kinds of medicalization and other kinds of science in general that psychedelics will just be a part of. Nothing exceptional. It's happening in other fields, right? You can't really, it's like they say in this book, no one looks at the clock to know what time is. You only look at the clock to know what time it is. So to know time is an experience of being alive and being human, and you have this experience of duration, right? So all these things play out in psychedelics, and this very long philosophical trend of reductionism and materialism, which they try. This is a metaphysics, and many people use this as like this is science, and if you step out of this, you're not in science any longer. I think this is very problematic and is a power dispute that has been going on for ages now.
Thanks, Eduardo, for bringing up this idea of the plurality of sciences, that it's not just one. And a question that comes up for me here is also in how far can psychedelics be part of changing the whole science game or create a different science or psychiatry?
I understand Eduardo as with asking for a broader approach to medicalization. My initial response is, oh God, no. But that has to do, of course, with the way in which I do think that psychedelics can provide, or experiences of different kinds can help people in communities and groups and self-exploration, and sort of, if they choose to undertake that without that being within a medical framework at all. Yeah? As long as we mean medicine in any sort of healing, then we can include much more into this, such as religious uses, for instance, with experiences, kinds of ecstatic experiences within community that serve within a particular explanation of the world that can have very healing effects on people. So this would be a very broad understanding of medicine that again gets us out of the space of science, of medicine as a science. And there is a way in which one could say medicine is a humanities. It always has been, because it starts and it ends with a human. And the human is not a scientific or a machine as a body or as a mind. It is this complex person with their experience. And whatever you do to them is sort of reflected back in the way in which they then think their world. We are permanently in a process of change. This is what duration also refers to, our life world with Husserl. So there is this, or process philosophy in Whitehead, you can there are many different approaches to describing that the present as always reaching out in the future, which is where we have some choices, but the present is configured of an infinite amount of other processes that create that moment right here now, and who is here, why you are here. All this is sort of part of this endeavor. And the ways in which psychedelic experiences can be playing a role in how people decide to relate to the world could be much more than medical, even in the broadest sense of medical. And of course, when we say medical or scientific medical, then we have such a strong apparatus we call upon as giving authoritative judgment on what is and isn't okay. I'm not sure psychedelics are necessarily a matter for science generally. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be aspects that sciences, whether that is medical science or neuroscience or social science, for instance, healthcare science, can engage with. But there are other aspects of social and community practice that might not be easily squared with the ideas that contemporary science pushes forward of how it understands itself, to even bring that in. So maybe there is a outside science, legitimate way of engaging, thinking, and using psychedelics.
Yeah, I agree with part of what you said, but I want to bring a note of caution. So in Brazil, what we see is an ongoing 30-year process of expansion of the use of ayahuasca that was regulated, not legalized, but regulated in the 80s and 90s based on psychiatry, anthropological, cultural, religious, interdisciplinary working groups. But I've seen quite a few, and I've been personally called by organizers of churches and rituals because when bad things really happen, they start thinking, wow, it would be good to have a psychiatrist on board to help us understand these difficult reactions. So I think it's important as well to talk about the risks, and that, yeah, doctors and psychiatry, they have a play they have a role in this, to play in this as well.
Speaking of psychiatrists, Franklin, you want to ask something?
Franklin, local psychiatrist. I think one thing that I think about more and more as the years go on regarding psychedelic exceptionalism are these much more subtle forms of psychedelic exceptionalism, which I would categorize as largely clustering around sort of the various critiques that people levy at the systemic barriers to widespread understanding, cultural embrace, medical applications of psychedelics in the right way, whatever that means. And particularly, Christine and Eduardo, both of you, I think, spoke to issues that are barriers to psychedelics, but that I think, and you just spoke to this somewhat, really are applicable to all of psychiatry and all of science. And I worry sometimes that there's sort of this blind spot where people are sort of focusing in the examples that you give, sort of issues with randomized control trials as pertains to psychedelics. And yet, as you shared in your talk, most psychiatric drug trials do not measure blinding, and the ones that do show that blinding is not very successful. And Christine, when you talk about an experience-based science, I think that's a fascinating solution, not just to the issues of psychedelics, but just to the issues in subjective experience, which might just be another way of framing what psychiatrists really ought to be thinking about. So I just wonder, particularly the two of you could comment on that.
I think psychedelics are just making the issues in psychiatry more acutely obvious, but the issues are pretty much the same. It's just that, like, we've been pretending that the king was not naked for all the psychiatric trials, but it wasn't blinded. But now we can't pretend anymore that blinding is working. And then it becomes really problematic, as we argued in the Nature Mental Health paper, because it becomes a double standard. Many drugs approved despite unblinding, and some drugs rejected because of unblinding. And that's really problematic for regulatory science.
I mean, traditionally, science conducts experiments. And the clinical trial is a very specific form of an experiment. It's quite ritualized, standardized, and pressed into a particular form. And one could wonder whether or not, when we talk, in a way, living is an experiment. And going to talk to a psychotherapist is an experiment. Go there, if you haven't met them before, you have no idea what's coming, and there's huge apprehension, and it might be a highlight of your day, it might be completely frustrating. The ways in which we need to maybe think about the ways, when we have psychiatry as a part of medicine that really doesn't relate to the body, it relates to what people feel and what they do, and where there is disagreement or unhappiness. Either the person themselves has huge suffering from their mental illness, or it is others who actually say that person should really deal with something and make them to start going to look into their addiction problems, their depression problems. So it's always both. There is a sort of normative ideal of what a person should be like, and then there are the ways in which we feel, which we permanently, and Foucault has described this very well, we are permanently measuring ourselves. And there is great anxiety created from psychiatry of the worst mental illnesses. I remember when I was young, if you had a psychosis diagnosis, that was basically the end of your career. Once you've had a psychotic episode, you had a schizophrenia somewhere in your health records, you were basically an outcast because you could no longer be trusted. This way in which we are so inflexible and rigid and take the experience not for what it is and don't allow, we always write the present into the future. We stigmatize instead of actually trying to find pathways of relieving suffering in the experience that would then lead to a different way of setting oneself in relation to these norms and standards against which we are made to measure ourselves all the time. So I think psychiatry is ultimately the medical profession that looks at experience and the way in which experience and behavior can be modulated so that a person is in a way in the world that they like, that they can live with, maybe be happy with even. That would be so exciting. But this is not how it describes itself. And I think that, I know this was a very bland sort of way of putting it, but I do think this is what psychiatry ultimately is and what it should engage with in the use of psychedelics, as well as in what kinds of interventions and experiments in living it actually values as part of a meaningful therapeutic and productive therapeutic intervention.
I would like to open the floor again to you in the audience to ask more questions. There's a few more hands.
Hello. Thank you so much for the great presentations. My name is Jeff Bro. I'm a program lead for psychedelics and spirituality here at the Divinity School. And my question is a prescriptive question, I think building on the conversation that we've just been having, but asking really, what do we do about this problem? One of the things that I keep hearing being discussed is the way in which the sort of socio-cultural authority that medicine has dominates our imaginaries of what is possible with these substances, how they can be used, and how they must legitimate themselves. And it's often, I mean, this is built into the CSA, you know, the reason they're Schedule I is because they have no medical use, but it's also just a product of how we as society sort of fetishize the medical and healing and doctors. And I'm curious, from a policy or regulatory or even just sort of cultural alternatives, how you would imagine, any of you would imagine, spiritual use, recreational use, personal use, being able to stand on its own without having to make itself legible to medicine. What are ways that that could be inculcated or sort of supported in these different spaces?
I mean, quickly, I think the problem that with your question is that you've limited it to medicine, because we've had a discussion earlier about this way in which medicine and its sort of purpose to achieve new, better forms of healing, say, yeah? The orientation towards healing that medicine has as a discipline is already written through with other logics of profit, of the pharmaceutical industry, of, you know, it's not, or the health insurance system we discussed. So the ways in which we put medicine there, when medicine is actually just the sort of mushroom that grows out of a web, rhizomes that are actually very powerful in our society to organize it, makes this question difficult to answer. Because with medicine, you always have the positive side of the healing aspect, whereas we've actually seen that it is sort of just, there is so much more to it, because medicine is an institution, not an ethic.
Yeah. I think there's interesting parallels between these debates about psychedelics. Oh, sorry. Better? Okay. There's interesting parallels between these debates about psychedelics and the debates about abolition and police. And in both of them, there's this fundamental question of that we can't imagine safety outside of medicine or policing, right? And so I think there's this, we can't imagine how we would keep people safe, as in like Eduardo's example, right? You have someone who's having a psychotic break in an ayahuasca session. What do you do, right? And I think there's similar conversations that happen around policing and citizen oversight of policing, and can we abolish the police? We're not sure, but what would safety look like? And I think we still have that same problem. I'm an anthropologist. I'm way better at critique than prescription, so I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that it does demonstrate how powerful those institutions are to how we think about what keeps us safe. And we also have to question the fact that for many people, the medical system is not safe. For many Black Americans, the medical system has been a site of discrimination and challenging of their pain. And so simply assuming that medicalization is safe is oftentimes, at least in the United States, a site of privilege, which assumes access, which assumes visibility and credibility within those institutions too. So
I'll try answering first in a very concrete way, but more limited, and then more speculative. In terms of evidence assessment, the solutions are all out there. So for some 10 years, maybe more now, there's a movement called EBM+, evidence-based medicine, 2.0, updated. That came from the philosophy of evidence in medicine, and they have guidelines on how to make evidential pluralism instead of evidence hierarchy. So you have a plurality of study designs of scientific approaches, and the task of evidence-based development is really to balance all those evidences and get to a more coherent understanding of any medical intervention than this rigid hierarchy of EBM. So this is all out there, is available. To those who know, it feels like a bit like, why is drug development still following the hierarchy? This is kind of outdated. The problems are well known. This has been discussed for decades. So that's my concrete answer for psychedelic drug approval. I think what we need is evidential pluralism and perhaps something like EBM+. There are other options available too. And I'm probably in 2 to 3 weeks, I'll come out with a new preprint that complements the first one, dealing specifically with this. And then the more speculative part of the answer is, I think, when I speak about broadening medicine and you raise concerns, I totally understand the concerns, but I think that if we broaden, we also answer some of the concerns regarding the power of medicine and its authoritarian practices. So for example, there's not just one medicine, right? There is Ayurveda, there is Chinese medicine, there are different medical systems out there. And perhaps we should start talking about and conceptualizing what psychedelic medicine actually is. And I think that psychedelic medicine can even help heal medicine itself as it currently is, with people overworking, overstressed, burning out, and many, many problems that we see in medicine nowadays. that might be ameliorated if people had more compassion, more listening time, more therapeutic alliance, and so on and so forth.
Jeff, that was a great question. I have a few sort of concrete reactions. The first would be greater association awareness and essentially associations of nurses and pharmacists and doctors, as well as public members working together to create a universal code of ethics, which does not exist. And then I think another concrete action might very well be taking psychedelic medicine and creating, maybe in partnership with National Academy of Sciences, some papers. And, there's very concretely, there are ways in which practitioners and people can craft a proposal to work with the National Academy of Sciences. And that it costs money, obviously, but then you'd have government buy-in on possible implementation. And then the third thing I'll say to your excellent question is that we're getting models from places like Oregon and Colorado that might, trigger new developments and point us in new directions. And so just recently in Madison, one of the committee leads for implementation in Colorado presented to faculty and staff and students around some of the hiccups with credentialing and licensure and facilitation models in Colorado. And it seems to me that that might be a place also for us to sort of learn in the, months ahead, because January 1 is when it starts in Colorado. So those would be my thoughts.
We have 2 questions online that I still want to pose for the audience, for the speakers, of course. So one is asking more for a prescription of sorts from you, what you would say to someone who is not so educated on psychedelics and who might want to embark on a psychedelic experience. If you feel called to give any recommendation there, please do. And the second one is from someone from Brazil, who's very happy that Eduardo is here at the podium. And this question is about the coming together of right-wing politics and psychedelics and how we could make sense of that.
That's a difficult one. I don't feel particularly in a position to give a good answer. Not being a sociologist or anthropologist, I think these folks are stronger to take this question. But I grabbed the mic just to share this story that not many people are aware of. But in the recent past, the president of Brazil was Bolsonaro, who is like really close to Donald Trump, is the same kind of view, behavior, and ideas. And he tried to create a new party in Brazil. And one of the first signers of this new party was a lawyer who is a master at the União do Vegetal, the UDV, one of the main ayahuasca churches in the country. So it's not unique to this country. It's puzzling to many people, this association between right-wing and psychedelics. But I also see that here in the US, there seemed to be some sort of naive understanding in the past few years that psychedelics were always associated with the left, and that's not true. If we look to the history, there was one, maybe you remember his name, is this guy, he traded uranium and he took LSD like in large amounts everywhere, and he helped establish the mystical experience, high-dose psychedelic model with Christian images. So it has been going. Also, Albert Hoffman had some ties with right-wing thinkers. So it's not something new. And again, I think it's nothing of this is in the substances. It's just like people encounter these substances and they have their experiences with them. And this is is available for indigenous, non-indigenous, blacks, whites, and left or right. It doesn't depend on your political views. You will have experiences and you have ideas in these experiences.
I would like to say something on this. I've been talking about that hero's journey, and I do think that this mind bending really is something very real in this way in which psychedelics within the medical model, where we can see it because people write exactly of how they configure it. At least there is a certain transparency to which medics are forced because they need to publish. So there are some benefits to the scientific apparatus, which when people just go underground using psychedelics to manipulate other people, which can be done. Especially this idea of neuroplasticity it just means that the everyday organization of mental function is offset and stuff is happening. That doesn't mean this is left or right-wing stuff. And most of the things that happen might have to do with neither. But I'm not sure this distinction left and right wing works. It worked with Ernst Jünger or the Nazis, but I'm not sure it actually is so very helpful today. The question is one of, if psychedelics stay within the medical model, then they will be largely used to make people be fitting better within the existing system, make them better functioning. That is also the ideology on which, for left or right wing, they may be some Californian rich people have been promoting low dose use of LSD or other substances to make themselves more effective. You know, there is this way in which we can just be better capitalist performers. And that itself seems to me a problem. The other thing is that psychedelics can be seen today, especially with a wide range of uses, including the religious, the self-realization, the seeking, the mystical, and the transcendental, as actually distracting us from the real stuff that goes on around us, which really needs sorting out and fast, in my personal view. So there is a way in which we are on a sort of precipice, you know. There's a way in which psychedelics can very easily be seen as yet another thing, such as spending your life on streaming Netflix, or all these things that our society provides for us to not engage with as grown-ups, voters, citizens, activists. We could engage if we channeled our energy accordingly. So there's this maybe that I want to eschew the left and right in this, but I think there is a way in which there is a very potential way of keeping people silent by providing them with psychedelic mystical experiences. And I do see that as a risk of medical as well as unmedical use.
Yeah, so thanks to everyone for this great discussion. We've reached the end for today, but we know we have more to discuss tomorrow, where we meet again here in this room at 9 a.m. And we will go on a little longer tomorrow and with the same enthusiasm and critique as well.
Even the best trips have an end, so.
Thank you everyone for coming.